Now I want to turn to a very important phenomenon, the presence and power of religion in politics. Right now, and I was just reading about it in the New York Times this morning, the Christian Coalition is distributing 45 million voter guides. 45 million, not 45,000, sorry. 45 million voter guides to churches and synagogues and mosques all over America, telling people how to vote this coming Tuesday. So if you want to talk about religion and politics, there is an organization representing millions of people with a lot of money that believes that indeed religious institutions should be very actively involved in the political situation. Simultaneously with all of that, of course, and I read about that in the New York Times, there was this breakfast where a man by the name of Barr, a Southerner who has been pursuing Bill Clinton, was roasted. And his friends roasted him because he's a very serious man on the edge of humorlessness. And they roasted him because it was very, very clear that his campaign against Bill Clinton had failed. And even his own friends were poking fun at him, and he was not in the mood to laugh. Because that's another issue. If indeed 45 million voter guides are being distributed by people who hate Bill Clinton, the other side of it, and we have to look at it as part of religion and politics in America, is that despite the assault, the campaign to remove Clinton from office has basically failed. So that's an interesting juxtaposition. You see, got those two things. Hold on to them because we're going to get to them as we build the story. But there has been in America two dramatic developments. One is certainly the rise of the religious right. But the other development is a radical change in the attitudes of the American people toward the behavior of both public and private figures. And the two may not be compatible. They're in opposition to each other. So I want to talk about both, but I have to first build the story. First of all, if I'm going to talk about religion and politics, I want to give you a perspective on the connection between the two historically. Religion remains one of the most powerful activities and forces in the world. And the power of religion, and it's important to understand it in order to understand the power of organizations that wish to involve themselves in politics. One is the message. I mean, the message of religion is a message so powerful that people will stop and listen to it and give their money to it and give their life to it, because after all, religion can give them something the government can't. It's called immortality. I mean, the government can cut your taxes or build you a road. Do you understand? I mean, so in the end, no message on the part of government can meet the message of religion. And historically, governments have always sought to attach themselves to the power that religion. It isn't only one way. It isn't that religion has tried to attach itself to government. Governments have always tried to attach themselves to the power of religion. And another reason, obviously, is that religion has always represented, in most cultures, the power and the message of our ancestors. So that when you talk about religion, you're also talking about all the people of the past who give roots to our lives. And in fact, governments have always been interested in tacking on to those roots. Another reason is that religion, by virtue of ancestors, has always been associated in most cultures with patriotism. In fact, they become inseparable, so that you can't talk about being Irish without being Roman Catholic, without being Polish and Roman Catholic, without being Arab and Muslim. I mean, they're all tied together. Your ethnic and patriotic identity and your religion go together. And that has been a sustaining force. In fact, all governments have wanted to tap into it. One of the reasons, obviously, is that religion offers legitimacy. For most of human history, rulers define their legitimacy not by saying the people elected me. It's irrelevant. They defined their legitimacy because they said God chose me. In the Bible, all the kings derive their legitimacy from where? From whom? From elections. They're all anointed by deputies of God. Your legitimacy derives from the fact that what? Not the people chose you, but that God chose you. So governments are rushing to get religion into them. It isn't the reverse. Historically, governments ran to get religion into them. One of the reasons, obviously, is that until modern times, one of the few groups of people who could read or write and manage a government were the clergy. That's why we had so many priests and bishops. They were all involved there because where are we going to get your managers? The Harvard Business School had not yet been born. So, in fact, the clergy were very powerful because they were the representatives of literacy in the culture. They were your management team, and so governments rushed to what? To recruit the clergy because the clergy were useful. And above all, governments want to appear moral. And the people who were regarded as the arbiters of morality were the clergy and the institutions of religion. So obviously, if you want your government to be perceived as moral, you want approval from the institutions of religion. And all of that power was reinforced by a society where most people felt very, very powerless, and where indeed religion offered them some sense of coping effectively with their environments, from the fact that the family was very strong. And in fact, the organization of society viewed from the family perspective fit the perspective of religion. Just as families had fathers, so did societies have kings, and so did universes have God. It was also reinforced by the fact that governments often turned over to religion two functions which are still being discussed in America in terms of the role of religion when people ask for money for parochial schools. And when people say, well, I'd like to send my kid to the parochial school because it's a more moral environment, that you hear that all the time, than the public school, all right? So one of the things that religion historically did for society was to manage both education and welfare. And government, secular government, turned over those two functions to organized religion. One of the reasons for certainly the reinforcement was that society was a fairly stable one, so that religious answers seemed to apply from one generation to the next. Now, government cooperated with religion. That is, it got a lot from religion. Legitimacy, do you understand? Ancestral approval, managers, the whole thing, got that. And in turn, government gave things to religious institutions. One, they used the power of the police or the army or the state to enforce religious conformity. When the great salvation religions emerged in the world, whether it be Christianity or Islam, Judaism, whatever, one of the ideas that went with those religions was that there was one true religion. If there was only one true religion, then religious institutions needed the government to enforce the removal of all opponents who were not representatives of the one true religion. And that's what governments did, right? If I look at the Spanish Inquisition, it certainly enforced conformity. Those people who were not willing to abide by the teachings of the Roman Catholic Church were arrested and removed, and that was done. The government did that. The government now intervened to cooperate with the institution. The second thing it did was censorship. to prevent the publication of ideas that religious institutions found offensive. Now, we're still arguing that in this society, right? I mean, the issue of censorship is still a lively one, a continuing dialogue. The third was that the government gave money to religion. Now, you have to understand, certainly prior to modern times, most of the wealth was concentrated in the hands of the few people, namely kings and nobles. And what they chose to do was to give large amounts of money to religious institutions. That's how churches got what? Got built. That's how large tracts of land were given away to the church, which became one of the great landowners. All right. One of the functions of the government that helped religion was to persecute the people who would not conform. And in many cases, they would either expel the people, burn the people, I mean, whatever else it was, to persecute the opponents. Obviously, when you talk about the story of France, the way that the Count of Paris, who was the king of France, got hold of southern France was, he chose to go on a crusade against the heresy in southern France, and by going on that crusade was able to conquer all of southern France. Now, one of the things that government did was that it incorporated religious symbols into its patriotic symbols. Now, if you look at many of the flags of the world in Europe, they have crosses in them, don't they? I mean, theoretically, either Sweden or Switzerland are what? Secular, state separation, well, not in Sweden so much, but almost. Religion and government, but they're open societies. But yet the symbols of the state bear the what? The symbols of religion are to be found in the flags everywhere. You cannot separate religious symbolism from national symbolism. They went absolutely together. One of the ways was obviously that the government used the clergy certainly for ministers and managers and for services to the public. Now, this union was the common way in which religion and government operated. You would be hard put to find any government in the world prior to the 18th or 19th century that did not have an alliance between religion and government. It isn't that that alliance is unusual, it's what? It's the usual. That's what happened. They both needed each other and they came together. But in Western Europe, this alliance ran into problems. First, the alliance with religion made religion corrupt in some cases. It gave it too much power, and when you have too much power and you never change the personnel, then in all cases power corrupts. And in fact, the clergy became corrupt. One of the problems, obviously, with the alliance was that as the prosperity of Western Europe increased, the cities grew. As cities grew, they engaged in extensive trade. As they engaged in extensive trade, they had to trade with people from outside their place who were not necessarily members of their own religion. Could they be welcome into the cities? Could you conduct trade with these people? The whole thing. The diversity of society, which we now experience here in America, where somebody's Catholic in this house, somebody's Protestant in this house, somebody's Jewish in this house, somebody's Hindu. I mean, that's different from the way it used to be. It's a world of diversity now creates a problem. That is, if the government is enforcing religious conformity, that undermines the business and the economy of the people. Certainly the major provocation was that in the 16th century, an event called the Reformation took place. It's called the Protestant Reformation, and what it did was it divided up the countries of Western Europe, and civil war now broke out between Catholics and Protestants. And now governments were faced with an issue. It wasn't an issue of cooperating with religion, it was an issue of cooperating with which religion? In France, the King of France couldn't figure out, should he support the Catholics, should he support the Huguenots, which side? And both sides claimed to be the one true religion. And that happened in England, and it happened in Germany. And it was terrible. In fact, the Civil War raged for a century and a half. Certainly, one of the changes that occurred was that in Western Europe there arose a movement which arose from the economic prosperity and change. We call it the Renaissance. And the Renaissance provided a new way of looking at the world. One, it was a movement that took pleasure not in the next world, but in this world, and in the beauties of this world. And secondly, it fostered, through its writers and intellectuals, something that we call skepticism. Skepticism is something that we encourage in America. It's called "I'm from Missouri." Prove it. Skepticism doesn't mean that you don't believe anything. It simply means that if somebody gives you a statement, you don't say, "Aye, aye, sir." You say, "Well, it's a very interesting statement. Now, what evidence do you have to support the statement that you're making?" We call it critical thinking. And critical thinking and skepticism has not always been good for religious establishments. Because once you start thinking in that way, you may ultimately agree with the establishment, but the whole process of first challenging before you will accept already begins to undermine part of the structure. Now, the response, and it's very important to get a handle on this, the response of Western Europe to this challenge was the following. One was persecution. That is, let's take Louis XIV in France. In 1685, he expelled all the Protestants. That was an answer. We solved the problem, got it. In the interim, he wrecked the economy, right? Because he expelled the entire middle class, the significant middle class in France, and France never recovered from this whole thing. Isabella did the same thing in Spain in 1492. She expelled the Jews and undermined the economy, but it's an answer to the problem. But it was not a very successful answer. There were three other answers that emerged, and one emerged in England after a terrible internal civil war. It wasn't until 1689 and 1690 that the English finally arrived at this. It's called toleration. Toleration is the following. Yes, we have a Church of England. Yes, we support it. We give it money, and it is the one true church. Okay. But we're sick and tired of fighting. So, we will tolerate other people. We won't give them any money. Do you understand? We won't support them. But they will be allowed to what? To continue to practice. And that was the result of the famous Glorious or English Revolution of 1689. And out of it came this pattern. That is, there is a Church of England. It is the official state church. It is supported by the government. But if you're a Methodist, you can have a chapel. If you're a Baptist, what? You can have a chapel. If you're a Presbyterian, you can have a what? You can have a chapel. These people were called dissenters, all right? But they were allowed by this compromise, because people were sick and tired of fighting, they were allowed to have their place. So toleration doesn't mean equality. Toleration simply means you're not equal, but what? You want to do it, go ahead and do it. And that became a pattern. See, a pattern that was transferred initially to America in most cases. But it was a big change. And the third is called joint subsidies. So let me explain. Joint subsidies means, yes, there may be an established church and we give it money. But since we're tolerating you, we'll also give you some money. Everybody gets a chance to be supported by the government, not just the established church. In Scotland, for instance, the Church of Scotland was Presbyterian. But since Scotland was united with England, they allowed Episcopalians to have churches in Scotland, and then they would give them some money. Oh. So that means joint subsidy. Joint subsidy is we're no longer into supporting only one church. If you can establish yourself as a reasonably legitimate religion, we'll give you what? Money. So if you extend the principle of joint subsidy, it means, yes, you'll give to the Episcopalians, but you'll also give to the Presbyterians. Nobody's left out. You give to the Jews, ultimately. You'll give to anybody who shows up. On the surface, that appears to be a what? A very, very tolerant solution, but it does mean that religion is supported by the government and also offers its support to the government by legitimizing it. The last one was an idea that came from the Baptists. Not all the Baptists. Some of the Baptists, and certainly one Baptist who made his way to America. His name was Roger Williams. He founded the colony of Rhode Island. And as you remember, the Baptists believed that you can't be baptized until you're an adult and knowingly what? Know what you're getting into. Having your parents baptize you, I mean, deprives you of the freedom of choice. They've already committed you before you can even discuss the issue. Well, if that's the case, if you need to be an adult and freely choose, then Baptists were very much into what we call individual freedom. And therefore they said there should be no religious coercion. When people grow up, they should be able freely to choose. So, in fact, it was in Rhode Island that an experiment happened. The experiment was religious freedom, which meant, I mean, even the Jews showed up in Newport, I mean, because they had what? They had religious freedom. The idea was that, indeed, religion should be a matter of free choice. That doesn't mean that the state would not support it. Roger Williams was not opposed to the state supporting religion. It simply meant that why shouldn't the state be nice to all religions? That's not separation. Got it? Simply means it's on the edge of joint subsidies. But it's more than joint subsidies because it now allows for complete religious freedom, and that was an idea that was put into place in this little itsy-bitsy state called Rhode Island. So we're now in America. In America, there were three of the alternatives were practiced at the beginning. Persecution was there. Anybody who knows about Massachusetts and the stories about Cotton Mather and the Pilgrims and the Puritans, they were not into religious freedom. They were into freedom from persecution by the Church of England. But once they got to Massachusetts, do you understand? They were in charge. And you didn't show up at their church on Sunday morning, you were what? Finished. So, and their opponents were driven out of the colony. So they were a mirror image of what was going on at that time in England and all over Europe and all over the world. So persecution was part of it, and that remained part of the story almost until the middle of the 18th century, the beginning of the 18th century. The second was what was practiced in New York, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. It's called toleration. Toleration is that we have an established church. That church is the Church of England. But if you're a Presbyterian, if you're a Methodist, do you understand, whatever else it is, you are allowed to open your own church, but you're not going to receive any help from the government. Toleration, but no help. Now, no colony or state ultimately took the joint subsidy route. We don't have any. They skipped one of the alternatives. But the freedom alternative was adopted by two colonies. And for one of them, which was very big, it proved to be a boon. It made it the most prosperous colony of all because it allowed all kinds of people to come and stimulate the economy. One of them was obviously Rhode Island, but Rhode Island is so small that if you sneeze, you most likely blow across the borders. So, I mean, there's not a lot of room for economic development, although they got a good port there, Newport. Okay. Yeah. But the colony that followed that pattern was Pennsylvania, the Quakers. And Pennsylvania was the one that got all the Germans, and they got a lot of Jews, and they got all these people came to Pennsylvania because there was the freedom, and that made Pennsylvania one of the richest of all the colonies. Philadelphia, which became the first capital of the United States of America, was chosen because it was a very, very prosperous city. It went to prove that where you have religious freedom, you have economic prosperity because you can accommodate diversity. Not that everybody got the lesson then, it's just that if you look back at it, it's certainly true. Now, there now arrived an aggressive fifth alternative. And the aggressive fifth alternative was different from the four that had emerged in the 17th century, primarily in England, but also in other places of Europe. That was an alternative that came out of a movement that arose out of the new economic development. It was called the Enlightenment. And the heart of the Enlightenment, and I want to mention it because when I get to Clinton, I'm going to keep talking about it. One of the phenomena in the Western world that has now spread all over the world that started with the Renaissance is called the secularization of society. By secularization, I don't mean that people stop being religious. By secularization, I mean that their activity becomes more and more secular. So that is, they spend more and more of their time doing this worldly things and less time doing other worldly things. And so they're barely conscious of the change themselves. But that's obviously evidenced by the kind of society we live in now. If you lived in the Middle Ages, you would find that people were engaged in services and prayer and whatever 7 days a week. Now they generally do it on Sunday morning. That is, the amount of time devoted to it is now what? Crunched. It's less. And now you have more and more time for shopping, sports, whatever. It's called the secularization of activity. And what the Enlightenment basically represented was the secularization of society. And in fact, the leaders of the Enlightenment, the intellectuals of the Enlightenment, viewed organized religion generally in a hostile fashion, as institutions that were preventing progress. There was a whole new world being born, and they were standing in the way of progress. And the Enlightenment came up with a whole new set of ideas. One, that obviously the best method for the discovery of truth was not through faith, but through science. It came up with the idea that the primary unit of society is not the family, but the individual. It came up with the idea that indeed the best kind of society is not one that conforms to religious rules without question, but rather a society in which freedom is given to each individual. Now, the reason given by the Enlightenment is different from that of Roger Williams. Roger Williams simply meant that people should freely be able to receive grace from God and then make their choice. In the case of the Enlightenment, what it meant was there are lots of options around and people should be free to choose them. One of the ideas that arose among the radical enlightened people was the idea that authority did not derive so much from the top, but from the bottom, from the will of the people. And generally the mood of the Enlightenment, which was different from that of the religious establishment, was that of optimism. The religious establishment built its mood on pessimism, which is this world is a veil of what? Of tears. And we can't wait ultimately to leave it. Now we're going to make a bigger and a better world. But on the radical fringe of the Enlightenment, there was an idea that government no longer needed religion. And therefore religion only ought to be a private option. You can choose to be religious or now not religious. Before the option was you had to choose some religion or other, but now you could choose what? Not to be religious, and therefore the idea was the separation of religion and government. Now, that separation idea was embraced by a very significant group of Americans. And without their embracing it, it most likely wouldn't have happened, because had separation of religion and government been offered as to the vote of the people in 1776, they most likely would have rejected it. They weren't ready for that idea. Now, who were the intellectuals? There were three intellectuals in particular, American intellectuals we now revere, who basically were children of the Enlightenment and articulated these ideas. One was the first great American philosopher, Benjamin Franklin. There's no doubt about it. He was the Ben Franklin with the kite and the electricity and the experiment. That guy who came from Boston to Philadelphia and who was there at the Constitutional Convention is one of the great, like a pragmatic, American philosopher. All right, fine. So, the second figure was Thomas Jefferson, no doubt about it, coming from the Virginia aristocracy. He certainly was one of the intellectuals of the Enlightenment, and one of the first things he sought to do was to arrange in his own state of Virginia for the separation of religion and government. He was supported by Patrick Henry, but that's different from joint subsidies. Do you understand? Joint subsidies, we're going to give money to what? To everybody. Now we're going to have separation of religion and government. There's no reason now for government and religion to be wed. And the third figure was James Madison. So you had Franklin and Jefferson and Madison. Those were the three intellectuals who were most committed to the idea of the separation of religion and government. And Ben Franklin, more than Jefferson, because Jefferson was away in Paris as an ambassador. Ben Franklin was there at the time when the Constitution was drafted in 1787. It was Franklin, above all, who arranged for ultimately the separation, which was embodied not in the Constitution itself, but in the Bill of Rights that followed. So, now, what emerged, therefore, was this Constitution. And the separation movement was all triggered by the opportunity, the upheavals of the American Revolution. And when it was over, the American Constitution now bore a statement in the First Amendment which forbade the establishment of any religion. And therefore, the federal government of the United States was forbidden to support, do you understand, the establishment, to support any single religious organization as the established church of the United States of America, but it did not forbid states to do so. And in fact, states continued to do that until the 1830s. There were states in New England, for instance, that still supported the Congregational Church. And it wasn't until the 1830s, ultimately with the 14th Amendment and who knows what, all of that went. Now, neither states nor the federal government can do it. But that was an act on the part of a small group of intellectuals whose ideas ultimately seeped down into the public. Now, that decision received support from the American people over a long period of time. It took a good part of the 19th century before the idea sank in. So let me just mention some of the reasons, because they apply to today. One was the incredible immigration. America needed cheap labor to keep its economy growing. In order to get cheap labor, it had to import people whose religious backgrounds were different from those of the original Americans. Otherwise, they could have made a decision to close the doors. If they had made the decision to close the door, what? The economy wouldn't have gotten off the ground. But if you're going to bring in all this cheap labor and some of it's Catholic, well, then all of a sudden you're now creating a diversity. The second reason was that the diversity in America increased over the years for a very simple reason. Since the Constitution forbade government support of religion and granted religious freedom, it meant that anybody could organize any kind of religious group he or she wanted to, right? 3 people have a meeting in a living room, whatever. They got a new what? They got a new organization, and the government doesn't interfere. So over the years, what it meant in America was was the growth of denominations. I mean, one denomination after another. So by the middle of the 19th century, there were so many religious groups, picking any one of them to support or to establish became virtually impossible. The third and the most important reason was the rise and growth of the Catholic Church. There were very few Catholics in this country at the time of the Revolution. The Protestant world was overwhelmingly anti-Catholic. They were raised that way. So when Catholics arrived in this country, it was very, very disturbing. And now they arrived in huge numbers, Irish Catholics, German Catholics. I mean, they poured into this country. And then, because the so-called public schools were basically Protestant schools, they organized their own parochial schools. And now they said to the government, well, you support the public school, which is basically a Protestant school. Why don't we take the principle of joint subsidy? Got that principle? You give to the Protestants and you also give to the Catholics, and we all understand. Isn't that fair? We pay taxes. But the Protestant world, I mean, just stood up in horror at the thought of giving a penny to the Pope. That's what they said. Not a penny to the Pope. We won't give him a penny. And what basically moved large parts of Protestant America into the separation fold was their hostility and hatred of Catholicism. And that is why when we talk about Americans for Separation of Church and State, this organization, it was founded by religious Baptists who were determined that one penny would go to the Roman Catholic Church. They feared this church and its power. No money. So one of the great reinforcements, obviously, was that hatred. One of the supports, obviously, for the separation of religion and government was the need to Americanize all the immigrants. If you wanted to turn them into Americans, then you could teach them English and whatever else it is, but you had to allow them to hang on to some part of their roots, and the part of their roots you allowed them to hang on to was their religion. If you were going to accommodate all these people with all these religions, then obviously the separation of religion and government was important. One of the great supports was the creation of public state schools. So that when anybody brought up the argument, well, we want to have parochial schools, and in most places in Europe, schools were run by religious institutions, and therefore you gave money to the Protestants, you gave money to the Catholics, you gave money to the Jews. That's what they did. But in America, you could always say, there's no need for it, right? We have an institution that will create Americans. It's called the public schools. And therefore, we don't need to support all the others. And the final support came from the fact that as the 19th century wore on, more and more Americans became more and more secular. Not in terms of how they perceive themselves, but in terms of their behavior. And that secularization process made them more tolerant and more reluctant to use government to support religion. So a revolution took place in the United States of America. It became one of the first places in the history of humanity where religion and government were separate. The French tried it in the French Revolution, then they went back, and then they went forward, then they went whatever. However you view the development, back and forth. But in America, the process worked. It became a kind of role model. Now, that didn't mean that religion and government were totally separate, because a clean separation was not possible because the mood of the American people would not tolerate it. Because in the mind of most Americans, in some ways, Protestant religion was like the religion of America. So what survived were the residuals, and we all grew up with the residuals. So let me talk about the residuals. First of all, if you're a politician in America, you always have to talk about God. I mean, you do. I mean, Bill Clinton knows it, anybody knows it. I mean, even Jeffrey Feiger is now talking about God. I just heard him. No, I know what Feiger, I mean, I think, believes in what he has said on other occasions, but now he's very much, he quotes the Psalms and the Bible and God. But the point is, that's one of the residuals. That is, when it comes to elections and whatever else it is, there isn't separation. The politician is continuously, he's going to a prayer breakfast there, whatever, there he is. All right. The second residual, which is very important, is that at public ceremonies you invite the clergy. If you're having an inauguration, you what? You invite the clergy. Are you opening a session of Congress? You what? You invite the clergy. Are you having a graduation in high school, a secular school? You invite the what? The clergy. And they're either invoking God or Jesus Christ. Or, I mean, isn't that right? We all grew up with that. Now, for people who are in favor of the strict separation of religion and government, this is what? Intolerable, but that's the American system. Those were the residuals, because many of the people went over to the separation thing simply because they were anti-Catholic, not because they understood Ben Franklin or Thomas Jefferson or James Madison. One of the residuals was that in schools all over America, they had Bible readings. And they were perfectly what? Acceptable. And they also had prayers, right? Through the 19th century, early part of the 20th. Some of you went to schools. I went to the Detroit public school system, and Frank Cody had pretty well cleaned up that thing. But Detroit was an exception. In most parts of America, you had Bible readings and you had prayers, and everybody sort of what? Accepted it. It was one of the residuals of the system. And then came the symbols. I mean, ultimately, "In God We Trust" appears on the coinage and the whole. So there, throughout the system, there were what I call the residuals. And the last thing, which is very important, in order to be respectable in the United States of America, especially if you're running for public office or you're going to become a corporate executive, you had to belong to a religious institution. If you said, "Well, I'm not religious," you might not get you had to be one of various flavors. You could be an Episcopalian, a Methodist, a Presbyterian, a Baptist, but not religious was not acceptable. Your respectability. And in fact, even political candidates who weren't known for having any kind of religious interest have to create an identity. "I'm a Unitarian." Oh. You have to have you have to be identified. Jeffrey Feiger couldn't get up and say, "Well, presently I'm unaffiliated." Unaffiliated? Who can be unaffiliated? Not in this country. You could do that in France. In France, they'd love to get up. "I belong to..." "I do not go to church." You can't do that in the United States of America. It's one of the residuals of the system, that although we have separation of religion and government, it is very clear that your respectability is defined by your membership in a religious institution. You better find a label or you're not there. You don't have an appropriate identity. Now, this system worked. But then, right now, that system stopped working, and let me explain. What happened was that certain conditions arose in America that led to the revival of what I call religious politics. For a long time, most established religions in America were willing to settle for the residuals. Got it? They weren't willing to give up. If you touched the residuals, then what? Then they screamed. But if you didn't touch the residuals, they were willing to accept basically the system that was there. But now the provocation occurred, and the provocation basically has developed during this century, but in dramatic form over the last 40 years. So let me mention the provocation. One, and overwhelmingly, it is the decline of the family in the American consumer culture. And that is a source of enormous anxiety for people, even for people whose family condition may not be particularly good, whatever else it is. They become very anxious. And the sign of family decline, of course, was the rise of divorce in our culture. The second provocation was the development of birth control and the approval of birth control publicly, and the invention of artificial contraception, which basically changed the sex life of the American people. So now sex was no longer associated in some essential way with reproduction. It now became a source of pleasure, personal fulfillment, adventure, whatever. It was a radical change in terms of behavior. Third was the rise of feminism, which was inevitable in a consumer capitalistic economy of continuing change. The incorporation of women into the workforce and the rise of feminism, which completely altered the relationship of men and women in our society. One of the things, obviously, which flowed from birth control and contraception was sexual freedom. And certainly the dramatization of that began in the 60s. Do you remember suddenly in the 60s, everything was, cinema changed. I mean, before we saw Jane Russell in a haystack. Ooh, they lined up. No, 3 million people outside the theater. Today, Jane Russell in a haystack, ho-hum. I mean, I mean, do you understand? Frontal nudity, back nudity, side nudity. No, I mean, anything, everything. The advertising in just ordinary magazines and newspapers. And one of the things that triggered it also was an attempt to remove the residuals. The Supreme Court in the early 1960s, in this new mood of liberalization, attacked two things which were part of the residuals. One was Bible readings in the schools. Been happening all the time. And the second was prayer in the public schools. And once you assault the residuals, then all of a sudden people who are saying, well, I'm willing to settle for the residuals, you're taking away my residuals, suddenly rise up in rebellion. And therefore, what followed from it in the early 1970s was the emergence of a movement to rescue America from this terrible change. And the great message of that movement was the following. Morality is essential to a functioning society, a society that has any kind of meaning for its citizens. And the only way, obviously, we can have morality is through religion. Because the separation of religion and government, in particular, the last assault on our residuals, only demonstrates that what happens to our society is that there is moral decline. Oh. And so it was on the banner of morality, not on the banner of salvation or the banner of immortality or whatever, on the banner of morality that there now arose the movement of the religious right. And it had a campaign. The first part of the campaign was to say that we wish to restore morality to America. And by morality, obviously, was a great emphasis on what we call sexual morality. 2, we want to restore the residuals. Give us back our what? Our prayer. We had it before. We had separation, but at least we got a prayer. Give us back our Bible readings. And then they became even more aggressive because the third part of the platform was education. The reason why we have moral decline is because people no longer believe in the Bible. And therefore we have to persuade people to believe in the Bible. The Bible says that the world is 6,000 years old, and that all life began 6,000 years ago, and that human beings have no fundamental connection with animals. So they now became more aggressive. And now they insisted that indeed the public schools of America include the story of creation. And then they moved on. One of the reasons why we have all this sexual promiscuity, why families are breaking down, is because this pornographic, filthy literature is all over the place. What we need the government to do is to censor. What we need is some level of censorship. Otherwise, we will end up in this morass of violence and sexual promiscuity. And then they picked on three things as the sign of moral decay which they would oppose. One is promiscuity, which they associate often with sexual education. The second, which is a violation of the family image, is abortion. Children are removed on the basis of the woman's desire and not on the basis of what society may need and what may be needed in order to encourage and solidify the family. And the third, which has appeared certainly in the last 10 years, is the most provocative thing for them, is the issue of homosexuality. Got it? The banner and the religious right is off, but then comes the important thing. Now, the religious right has never demanded that they want a country in which there is an established religion. So they don't want to go back, because that's impossible. They don't want to go back to what was prior to the Enlightenment. What they want is what exists in many countries. So it's called joint subsidies. See, if I go to Holland, there is no established church. But in Holland, the government gives money to Protestant churches, to the Catholic Church, to Jews, to Muslims, and to humanists. Even to non-religious people who are organized in a philosophic association, they receive a government subsidy. And if you want to organize your own schools, you can do that. The government will offer you, do you understand, partial support for the institutions you create, and it's all equal. Oh. Now that's not the establishment of religion. No single religion is being what? Established. It's called joint subsidy. And now they came up with this idea, and obviously it was an interesting idea. It had a certain level of appeal. Well, you know, nobody's excluded. Everybody gets a chance to get what? Support. We're not trying to discriminate. We're not saying, let's make the Baptist Church the what? The established church of the United States of America, and then we'll tolerate the others. No. It's joint subsidies. Got it? Well, and joint subsidies is in many places. It's not only in the Netherlands, it's also in Belgium. It's also to some degree in England, and it's also in Canada, because Canada also provides support to Catholic, Catholic schools, and then they also have a state school. So it's right across the river. So the joint subsidies idea seems to fit into a kind of a democratic sentiment, and that was the idea that was proposed, and it was reinforced by certain things. It was reinforced by the fact that there arose in the 1960s and 70s something I call Southern white power. The South woke up because it was economically transformed by the movement of industry from the North after World War II, and it was aroused by the civil rights movement and the black power movement in the 1960s, and out of it came a support for what they considered to be the Southern and the American point of view. They weren't going to allow a bunch of Northern liberal intellectuals to take away their heritage. It was supported certainly by a reconciliation, very important reconciliation. In the 1960s and the 1970s, the ultra-right, the fundamentalist Protestants, made peace with the Roman Catholic Church. And in fact, anti-Catholic propaganda stopped. And now the Pope was a friendly figure. And the reason why people make friends that used to be enemies is that they now share a common enemy of their own. The common enemy that was now identified was secularization. The enemy is secularization, and therefore we share this enemy and we ought to come together. The third factor was the rise in power of both blacks and Hispanics, neither of which was attached to any tradition of separation of religion and government. For the black community, the main institution of their culture was the church. I mean, a black preacher couldn't understand why he couldn't go to a public school and say a what? And say a prayer. I mean, after all, you need God. So there it was. So, and the other were the Hispanics, who were overwhelmingly Roman Catholic, and it had not come out of any tradition of separation of religion and government, and they're growing in number. It was reinforced by the fact that ever since the Black Power movement, especially in the South but elsewhere in America, white fundamentalists had now created their own parochial schools. They were doing what the Catholics had done 100 years ago, which they denounced. So now all over America there are these Christian private schools. And now they want subsidies. The same thing happened to the Jews. No parochial schools. They use the public schools. Well, suddenly the Orthodox organize what? All these parochial schools, partly in response to the racial change in cities. And out of it came now this demand, even among certain Orthodox with capital O Jews, for state subsidy for parochial schools. It was also reinforced by the fact that fundamentalist religion or conservative religion could mobilize people easily because their people showed up every Sunday morning for services, and they could then instruct them. That's why these voter guides are being distributed to the churches. You have your fixed, not a mobile, floating audience. It was reinforced by the fact that they organized two very powerful organizations. In the early 1980s, the Moral Majority, and toward the end of the 80s, in the early 90s, what is now called a much more successful group called the Christian Coalition, which had been led by a man called Ralph Reed and now by a man called Randy Tate. All right. And above all, it was reinforced by the fact that the mood of optimism, which had been sustained in America until the 1960s, had been replaced by a mood of pessimism and disillusionment, where people were now complaining about the world and society in which they lived, and all of that lent great support. Let me describe the campaign. The campaign is use the media. Wherever possible, use the media. And in fact, the religious right became the masters of the use of the television medium long before anybody in the opposition was able to understand the strategy. The strategy was force all politicians to be role models of the religious life. So the new thing in politics is called the prayer breakfast. Everybody do you understand? They don't even have breakfast anymore. They have what? Prayer breakfast. Everybody goes. Even atheists have to show up. No. at prayer breakfasts. Everybody, Clinton shows up, and then you get your favorite clergyman. The Republicans had Billy Graham, so now they have Jesse Jackson, whatever else. And you all show up, and there's a lot of repentance and a lot of praying and a lot of the whole thing, and they're all in there for the prayer, the famous what? Isn't that not true? I mean, the prayer breakfast. Every politician shows up for a prayer breakfast. All right. The third strategy, obviously, was to take over one of the major political parties. Of the two, the more likely one to take over was the Republican Party, because already in the South, people were turning from the Democrats to the Republicans, and so the Republican Party became the goal. One of the campaigns was now to make sure we get our residual back. And the way we're going to get our residual back is to pass an amendment for the what? A prayer in the public schools. And this man from Oklahoma, his name is Istuk, he keeps time after time, keeps proposing this amendment. One of the campaign things that is very interesting is the campaign to privatize our economy, to take away from the state more and more of its functions. Now, there are certain people who aren't very religious who, from an economic point of view, want to privatize. But the religious right got into privatization because they have an agenda. Many of the people on the religious right are poor, they're not rich. And in fact, by privatizing and removing a large part of government support, they are punishing themselves economically, but that isn't the agenda. Once you begin to privatize, you will reach the fundamental institution which they wish to privatize. And that is called the public schools, the monopoly over education exercised by the state. So the campaign for privatization will ultimately lead to, well, if we can choose our insurance policy, whatever, let's choose our school, just give people the money, vouchers, and let them choose. Well, one of the parts of the campaign is now to find the enemy. The enemy, defined by the religious right, is in a word. That word is liberal. So terrible that very few people are willing to get up in public and say anymore, right? Has Clinton ever said that? I am a moderate is very good. But I am a liberal. It's instant political death. Except in certain constituencies. I mean, 6 I can count. All right. And last, and this relates to Clinton, one of the campaigns is to raise public awareness with regard to misguided or malevolent sexual activity. No, it's to raise the level of sexual anxiety in the culture and to relate that sexual anxiety to the collapse of morality in our culture, because the religious right is now posing religion as the great champion of morality. So, sexual scandals become the vehicle for raising public awareness. So I have a question. It's a very big question in the light of what's happened to Clinton. It's a powerful movement responding to powerful provocations. And the question is it succeeding or failing? If you want my answer, come back in 5 minutes. I want to ask 2 questions. One, where has the religious right succeeded and where has it failed? Success. Well, it has succeeded in creating a fairly substantial core constituency. For an organization to afford 45 million copies of the voter guide, they have to have some kind of monies. I mean, so they have, they claim to have several million members. I'm not sure what their membership rolls are. Most organizations tend to exaggerate their membership. what is very clear is that there most likely is in this country somewhere between 15 to 20% of the people who support this agenda. Got it? 15 to 20% of the people in America. It's substantial, because an organized minority can be very much more powerful than a disorganized majority. But it's not a majority. 15 to 20%. They mobilize these people. They can get them to a school election. They can get them out with pickets and posters and who knows what. They have those people. And so that's a success story. The second is that they have infiltrated successfully into the Republican Party, and now most Republican candidates are aware of their presence and fear them, even if they don't agree with them. And very clearly, over the last two political conventions of the Republican Party, the control, the power of the religious right is there. It most likely is true that the majority of the people who support the Republican Party do not agree with this agenda. But if you have a crucial core in your organization, the loss of which might give you the loss of elections, then you are the prisoner of that. Right. The third, they have pretty well taken over the South. The heart of their constituency, undoubtedly, is the old American South. They have been successful in portraying the public schools as inadequate. And they may have been reinforced by the experience of many people in the inner cities here, but obviously that propaganda has worked. You rarely hear on the radio, on television, whatever, positive statements, even though the public schools do well. You rarely hear those positive statements that are supportive, which are with a very different environment from what was 40 or 50 years ago. They have succeeded in pushing the privatization idea. More and more people like the idea of privatizing public services and allowing individual choice, maximizing personal freedom, and removing from the state monopolistic control of any area. So they have been successful in turning separationists into being very defensive. That is, although they're only 15 to 20% of the population, the way things happen is that they tend to be aggressive and separationists tend to be very defensive. Well, look what Thomas Jefferson said, look what James Madison said. That is, they don't seem to have the same kind of posture. And the defensive posture is always the weak posture. And they have high visibility. Everybody knows about it. That's a success story. But the other side is their failure, and we're going to have to analyze that. With all the money, with all the enthusiasm, in many very important ways, they have failed. Right. First, they have failed to produce a president that will pursue their agenda. Bill Clinton for sure not. But George Bush didn't. George Bush didn't do anything for the religious right. He doesn't really have strong sympathy for their agenda. Ronald Reagan said, love, 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 the moral majority, the whole thing. Either he didn't remember or, no. No. Or he had no desire to support them because he did not want to fall into their hands. So he kept verbally saying, yes, I love you, I love you. He gave them zilch, zero, nothing. They have not been successful in persuading either the president or the Congress as a whole to give them what they want. That is a massive failure. Two, they have failed to capture the center. Most Americans are not on the left or the right, they are in the center. The only way to win is to move from the right to the center. They have been unable to capture the center. The one thing that infuriated them with Bill Clinton was that Bill Clinton moved the Democratic Party from the left to the center and took the center. And most of the Americans in the center, they may express some sympathy for some of the issues raised by the religious right, but they don't want these people in charge of their country. Third, they have failed with the abortion issue. I mean, despite this incredible war, and it's true that certain amounts of abortion freedom have been restricted. But on the whole, it is highly unlikely in this country that abortion freedom in any massive way will be removed. There is no public support for the complete removal of abortion freedom in this country, and despite their propaganda and despite their shooting of abortionist doctors, whatever else, I mean, they haven't won that battle. They haven't won the battle against homosexuality, despite all their claims, and despite the fact that they frustrated certain laws and regulations for relief in various communities. On the whole, homosexual communities in America are thriving. And in fact, the public awareness of them, now they've got all these talk shows, sitcoms now. I mean, the whole media is what? Is filled with the idea, the cinema, the public culture. They haven't been able to change any of that. And they can't reverse it. They don't have the power, ultimately, to reverse it. They have been unsuccessful with the blacks. And the reason is that although blacks are one of the most fundamentalist of all constituencies, and should certainly support prayer in the public schools, Bible reading, I mean, to them it's not an issue. They feel alienated because it is very clear that at the core of the Christian coalition are Southern whites who do not give a damn about the economic agenda of the black. So yes, on the one hand you can recruit some of them, but you can't recruit most of them. They have failed with the Catholics. And the reason is that the Catholic Church has radically changed. There is a core group of Catholics who are very conservative who support the religious right. But the overwhelming majority of Roman Catholics in this country have been influenced by Vatican Council II. Talk to most of them, they say, well, I like the Pope on points 1, 3, and 5, but I don't like the Pope on 2, 4, and 8. I mean, no, that's it. From that group, you're not going to build supporters for the religious right. The Catholic population of America has radically changed. And many of them live in families with divorce and children living together in unmarried, I mean, they're all part of this whole picture. They have failed to get the Istuk Amendment passed. Mr. Istuk tries, put prayer. It does not get passed. They have failed in mobilizing what I call the religious in this country. The rival movement, religious movement to fundamentalism is called the spirituality movement. So it's widespread. It's all over bookstores. Everybody, a weekend here, a weekend there, or whatever. I mean, they're all into this now. So the spirituality movement isn't fundamentalist. The spirituality movement is anti-establishment. They're into what? I'm going to find my own guru and find my own way and find my own, do you understand, my own belief system. I like this one, not everything he says. I like this one, not everything she says. Put together. I mean, with that kind of a world, religious world, you're not going to build a what? A fundamentalist constituency. And half the people in the spirituality movement come out of lifestyles that are denounced and abhorred by the religious right. And they have failed in the Starr-Clinton encounter. Kenneth Starr comes out of a fundamentalist background, there's no doubt about it. And I'm not presently discussing the virtues of the assault on Clinton. I'm going to talk about that more next week. But the point is, there's no doubt that Kenneth Starr shares the conviction of the religious right. And they saw him as their what? Their star who was going to bring down the president and maybe open up the American public to the agenda of the religious right in some way. Well, that has failed. It is very clear that the American people are not interested anymore on the whole. When I say not interested, we're talking about, the polls indicate we're in the 60 to 70% of people who just want to drop the whole issue. Not the fundamental core constituency here, but they want to drop the whole issue. So you cannot go ahead without the support of American public opinion. I mean, even the Supreme Court knows that. Supreme Court decisions change when they sort of sense that, the public is somewhere behind. I mean, you couldn't desegregate education in 1895 or 1890. You could desegregate education in the 1950s because American public opinion at least had moved, forward in that case. So you can't proceed with this thing. You're condemning yourself to political failure. It's a failure. That's why this congressman looks so dour, Barr. I mean, he supported Starr and Barr. Okay, fine. So now comes the election that's coming up this Tuesday. And as we look at the election, it's different from what people imagined maybe a month ago or 2 months ago. The aggressive posture of the Christian coalition is backfiring. There are many, many Republican candidates in this country who do not wish to discuss the Clinton issue. They're afraid that it will backfire in their face. And in fact, there's a big controversy over the new ad campaign on the part of the Republican Party for the election. Whether it's successful or not will be determined obviously by the results. But it is very clear that they're getting a lot of adverse comment even from people within the Republican Party. The second thing is, talk about the Teflon man. Bill Clinton has rebounded. Every morning Hillary gets up and she says to him, look, you ruined almost everything, so you're going to work. You're going to work so hard, you're going to do something to divert the attention of the American people from Monica. Do you understand? So at 4 o'clock in the morning, he wakes up Netanyahu for a meeting. He's got to get he's got to get it, right? He is determined. He works all day, all night, and every morning Hillary says, you better go back. So he does. He brings together Netanyahu, Arafat, the peace agreement, and now he looks like the what? The hero. Hillary, who in the first term people avoided her. Miss Healthcare failure. Miss Pushy. Miss Aggressive. No, she is the abused wife. She is in a role that feminists deplore, the woman who accepts the abuse and says, I forgive him, I forgive him, I forgive him, I forgive him. There she is, and now she's one of those popular people. She travels all over the country. Democratic candidates want her to show up and to be on their side. So she's the hero, strangely enough. One of the things in the election is the public indifference to the sexual anxiety raised by the people on the religious. It's there. Whether it's justified or not is not the issue. I'm just describing, do you understand, the reality. There is this public indifference. And now there's the counterattack. The counterattack is growing, and basically the counterattack says the following. We have important things to do in this country, and Clinton's a good manager, and who are you trying to what? Upset everything. We got things, let's get off of this issue and on to important business. And that attitude obviously defines a large part of the attitude of the people in this country. So we have to face certain realities. See, one of the realities in this country is that although we have a strong and powerful religious right, the overwhelming majority of the people in this country, including members of the Christian coalition, are heavily secularized. So secularized that we accept and tolerate today what would have been unacceptable 200 years ago. In fact, William Bennett, a disgruntled Republican, just wrote a book, a bestseller called The Death of Outrage. It's just that the public opinion has won, has shifted. I mean, whether you like it, don't like it, I'm simply describing a reality. The second thing is there is enormous sexual toleration in this country. After 30 years of cinema, with frontal nudity, back nudity, side nudity, whatever, there's very little that anybody can do. In New York City, by the way, if you were doing sexual intercourse on Fifth Avenue, nobody would stop. No, they wouldn't. You'd have to do something more interesting. You'd have to do something more interesting. They won't stop. That's what's happened to America. You have to understand that, because the response to Clinton is a reflection of the fact that people say, who cares? No. Now, whether that indifference is appropriate, inappropriate, is not the point. Is it what? It is there, it exists, it indicates a radical change, and that goes to prove something. Ultimately, a capitalistic, consumer, free culture produces an environment which is much more powerful than any environment produced by any kind of religious organization anywhere, because that's what it is. One of the realities is that we have divided religions. Divided religions means that all the people who might be mobilized for the Christian right can't be, because they disagree on economic issues. Two of the constituencies, the blacks and the Hispanics, who should be part of this because after all, whatever, they are very wary of this constituency because it is ethnically narrow as they see it. One of the realities is that our society is experiencing, by virtue of our economic system, an inevitable change. And that inevitable change is so powerful that we will continue to have protest movements, but it is fairly clear that these protest movements, unless there is a gigantic, overwhelming economic disaster, do not have the power to reverse. I mean, I watched and I observed the response to the Clinton scandal. I see how the public responds to it. And the indifference on the part of most of the people is indicative of a change. So what does it mean for the future? Well, it means for the future of what I call this group, that they will remain a minority, an active, well-financed, troubling minority, but they what? Will remain a minority. They will, by the way, encounter now in the Republican Party resistance, because it is very clear that for the Republican Party to tie their future to these people will be to commit themselves ultimately to losing. That is, they may have immediate gains. The strongest point of the Republican Party, obviously, is its call for shrinking government and expanding personal freedom, which are very, very positive, whether you agree with it or not, very, very positive things. But this other thing, which is intrusive regulation, doesn't fit in with that message. The third is the Democrats ought to thank the Christian coalition for existing. They are very useful to the Democrats. And they've been very useful to Bill Clinton and whatever else it is, because you need an enemy that is powerful and that you can hate. And in fact, the Christian coalition has been a way for Democrats and to mobilize themselves, to mobilize the resistance. They are the what? The enemy. And yes, they remain the enemy, but they remain an enemy that most likely cannot conquer on the battlefield, but their presence and existence is very useful. What it means is that in the future, politicians will still continue to go to prayer breakfasts, tell people how much they love religion and the whole thing and whatever. That's one of the residuals. Never get rid of it. But that verbal religiosity is not translated into what I call public behavior. The society we live in is continuously being secularized, and this response to the Clinton scandal is, I mean, like an eye. It's like an eye-opener. It's an absolute eye-opener. I always say to people, you are not your mouth, you are your behavior. So I never listen to people's mouths so much. I mean, I listen. But if I want to find out what people are really like, I watch their behavior. And the behavior, I mean, is radically opposed to what the Christian Coalition would like. I mean, and the Christian Coalition families themselves, you know, have it. Within their families, there's what? High divorce, homosexuality, they're all there. It isn't as though they live in this separate world. The best tack for the religious right, and you're going to see it, is going to be the thing that relates to personal choice. It's called the voucher system. If they're smart, what they'll do is they'll shift from prayer and Bible readings, do you understand, to vouchers. Feed on the discontent that people have with the public school system, because in that area they may have some chance for success. But the last thing I do want to say is that right now, and you can see that from the face of Congressman Barr, the religious right is very confused. They have now found that there are many ministers of conservative Christian churches who are members of the Christian Coalition who do not wish to distribute the voter guide because they're afraid that they will get a negative reaction from members of their own congregation who are, do you understand, who are sick and tired of this controversy, and so there's a lot of confusion. So I want to conclude by saying a powerful movement has arisen in this country that wishes to re-involve religion with politics, not that religion has ever been separated from politics with all the residuals. Right? And they are aggressive, and they are well-financed. But it is very clear from what's happened here with the Clinton scandal, that was one of their major objectives, that they have failed, that they do not have the power to mobilize a majority of the American people for their agenda. And whether that conclusion pleases you or displeases you, you will have to decide, but it was a pleasure to see you this morning. Thank you.